Hello everybody, and welcome to 5 questions on the value of reading and of studying children's literature with Dr. Elizabeth Galway. My name is Louise Barrett and I work in the psychology department at the UofL. Dr. Elizabeth Galway is an associate professor and former chair of the English department at the University of Lethbridge, and she is also one of the founders of the Institute of Child and Youth Studies, which is an interdisciplinary scholarly institute that studies everything to do with children and youth, and she has been the co-director of the institute since 2018. Dr. Galway's research focuses on children's literature in the 19th and early 20th centuries, and she is particularly interested in how identity is shaped by and through children's literature. And this was the topic of her book, From Nursery Rhymes to Nationhood, Children's Literature and the Construction of Canadian Identity. And that was published in 2008 by Routledge. And she's just finishing up a new book now on British, American and Canadian children's literature from World War I. And we'll ask her a little bit about that later on. And she's also funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, a very interesting project that she does in collaboration with Dr. Kevin McHugh from the Geography Department, who was previously on 5 questions with answering questions about archaeology. And that project is concerned with representations of the ancient Near East in children's literature from the 19th century through to the 20th century, to the present day, more or less. So, welcome, Elizabeth. Thank you very much for being here. I'm very excited to chat to you. I haven't seen you for a while, so you're looking pretty good there. Clearly, things haven't been too tough for you during these times, or maybe they have, and you're just coping very, very well. Excellent. Okay, so I'm very excited. I've got some great questions to ask you. So the first one I want to ask you is, and I'm sure you get asked this a lot, so sorry if it's a boring question, but I really do want to know this. Like, what is your favourite children's book and why?
So that question, if you were to ask me in general, what is my favorite book, I would find nearly impossible to answer. But for whatever reason, it's easy for me to answer that when it comes to children's books, because I do have a favorite author. His name's Arthur Ransom, and you are familiar with him, Lou, because he's a British writer who set his stories in the English Lake District, as well as a series in the Norfolk Broads. And this is realistic fiction from the 1930s. It's about groups of children, a couple of families of kids that become friends, and they camp. They sail on the lakes of the Lake District and the Norfolk Broads. And those just captured me as a kid. And it's partly because these kids had a lot of freedom. They got to camp on an island without any parents and sail their boats, sometimes even at night. But really, I think it was about the fact that the child characters in those novels seemed so real to me. Like, every child had their own distinct personality. Throughout the series, each child character was always true to themselves. Like, they were just so realistically drawn. And I think that's why, more than any other book, those ones have stuck with me.
Following on from that, why do you think reading fiction is important?
So I think reading fiction is important for a lot of reasons. I think there's something magical about reading fiction, to be honest. And by that, I kind of mean that literally, because I think fiction can do something that only magic can really do, which is take you to different times and different places, allow you to experience vicariously, right, through reading about other characters, things that you just couldn't in the same way in the real world. And so I think fiction can do that in a way that almost nothing else can really, really do. And I think that there's value in that. So first of all, it's entertaining. And I think most people read fiction because they want to be entertained. And that's why I started out, right, loving fiction, not because I wanted to just analyze it, because I wanted to read it for enjoyment. So it's entertaining, it's pleasurable, but we also get other things out of that. It's educational, right? It is a way of learning about other things. But I also think fiction's important because, and people in the humanities and in literary studies talk about this idea that fiction creates empathy. because there's something about getting into somebody else's mind, which is what you can do when you're reading about other characters, that allows you to experience things from somebody else's perspective and see things from somebody else's perspective. And you know, you know a lot more about psychology than I do, Lou, but I think there's like some intrinsic kind of value in being able to do that, that allows you to understand other people. And I think when we understand other people and their experiences, that does lead to kind of greater empathy and just greater knowledge about the world and about other people.
Lovely. So this is like, I don't know, an addendum to that question, but I was reading about how people have been reading more during the COVID-19 pandemic, and it's been giving people, you know, as you say, not just entertainment, but also sort of comfort and solace. And, you know, people have been really turning to books during this time. And so, given that you're an English professor, I thought you would be a good person to ask whether you have any good recommendations for us. Anything you think will be valuable in particular to read at this time?
So I do think that taste in literature, like music, is really subjective. Although, you know, I obviously have ideas about what I think is good literature and what I think is good music. And, you know, if you like the wrong stuff, you know, it's a bad, it reflects poorly on you. But no, all kidding aside, it is really subjective. And so my recommendations are, you know, the things that I like. And I do tend to gravitate towards 19th century literature. I love 19th century fiction. Although with that said, two books that I've read in recent years that I do find myself recommending to people, they're not even fiction, they're both memoirs. So one is Jeanette Walls' The Glass Castle, which is about her really unconventional childhood growing up in this very kind of unusual family, moving around all over throughout the United States. And that's a fascinating book. And the other memoir is by Peter Goodwin. It's When a Crocodile Eats a Son, and it's about his upbringing in Zimbabwe. And I just found both of those fascinating. So they're not fiction, but they're definitely books that I recommend. But I think if you're on lockdown or you're stuck in a pandemic, it's a good time to catch up on some of those classics that have always been on your list that you've never got around to reading. So if you've never read Wuthering Heights, now this is the time to read Wuthering Heights. If you've never read any of Wilkie Collins' mysteries, things like The Woman in White or The Moonstone, The Summer, and particularly in pandemic summer, I think it's a great time to read those. And as for children's texts, Arthur Ransom, obviously, if you're looking for books to read for to get for your kids. But I also love Edith Nesbit, who's an Edwardian children's author. She wrote fantasy and realistic fiction, but texts like The Phoenix and the Carpet and The Railway Children. She's great. You can never go wrong with Frog and Toad, which are just wonderful little books about a frog and a toad who are friends, and I love those. And I've come to have a real love and appreciation for Mo Willems during pandemic. So Mo Willems is the illustrator and author of the Elephant and Piggy books, which you might be familiar with. And early on in the pandemic, he hosted a number of online art classes for kids, which were just fantastic. And my daughter loved those. And that's given me a whole new appreciation for Mo Willems. So I also recommend him for kids reading.
That's fantastic. Should have made notes. And I can vouch for the Peter Godwin book, because you recommended that to me, When a Crocodile Eats the Sun, and it is amazing. It's one of the loveliest books I think I've ever read, like really important and fascinating. So yeah, so I'll take your word for any book that you want to recommend to me, because I did enjoy that one very much. So talking about children's books, when I was a kid, I read a book called A Long Way from Verona by Jane Gardam, and that was marketed as a children's book when I was a kid, which is a long time ago now. And now I notice that it's now marketed as adult fiction. Like, it's literally now an adult book, because it deals with particular kinds of adult themes. And so I was just wondering, if you could tell me more about that. Is that a trend? Is it the case that children's literature over the course of the 20th century has become more childish, less challenging? Is that just is that a false impression that I've gained, or is that something that seems to have happened over the last sort of 30, 40 years?
So that's a really great question. And the idea of adult themes in children's literature is, in fact, that's exactly what interests me about children's literature and what I study. I'm interested in the so-called adult themes, things we might not automatically expect children's authors to be writing about, things like war, nation, imperialism. And that's what really interests me. I'm actually quite interested in what children's literature can tell us about adults and about what adults think about children, as much as I am about what it might actually tell us about children themselves. And I don't think these sort of ideas of adult themes or adult interests, right, have gone away from children's literature at all. But I do think, so here's what I would say in answer to that question of what changes do I see. I do think in terms of language, like the actual language of children's texts, I think there has been a change there. I do think they are a little less challenging. And the reason I say that is because I teach a lot of children's literature courses. I teach a lot of 19th century texts, but I also teach 20th century, more recent texts. And it's noticeable in those classes where I teach both. I see it with my students. You know, when they read Alice in Wonderland, when they read Little Women, which are not books, you know, which are books written for younger readers. And my students tend to be right in their late teens or in their 20s. And sometimes my students struggle a little bit with the language. And, you know, that's a little bit about vocabulary. It's a little bit about maybe cultural references being out of date and so forth. But when you read those texts and then you compare them to Harry Potter, you see a real difference. If you take something like Treasure Island and compare it to Harry Potter, where the age group of the reader is really similar, because obviously there's difference if you're looking at a book for a very young reader versus an older child. But when you compare for the same age group, I do think you see a little bit of a difference. And I'm happy to be corrected on that. You know, others might challenge me on that, but that's one thing I noticed because I read so much 19th and early 20th century literature. But in terms of the themes, or is stuff more childish or less challenging, I think we have to be really careful about trying to draw any clear conclusion there, or identifying a clear trend, because those terms themselves, as I know you know, Lou, are constantly changing. And so what we define as childish, that's never constant. That's always changing. And so that makes it really difficult to say, yes, a book is more or less childish. And, you know, the very fact that the book you cited was once sort of marketed for younger readers and is now marketed for adult readers, to me that actually suggests maybe it's part of this concern we hear expressed that kids are growing up too fast today, and the culture is exposing them to things sooner than they should be. And so that might be a response to the opposite, right? A response to people actually thinking that children are growing up too fast and having to face things earlier than maybe they used to. So I don't think there is a clear trend in that sense.
Given what you've just been saying about the things that you're interested in, could you tell us a bit more about the book that you're just finishing up? Because that seems to be dealing with those kinds of issues. So you said it's about children's literature from the First World War across Britain, America, and Canada.
Yeah, so my book, I like to joke about my book about the First World War that's now taken longer than both world wars put together to try and finish, but that's just what happens when life intervenes. So I started that a while ago. I got a Shirk grant for that in 2008, and that's when I started gathering sources. And at the time, I envisioned it as a book about Canadian children's literature of the First World War, which kind of led naturally on from my first book, which sort of ended in around about 1911, looking at the role of children's literature in constructing ideas about Canadian identity. So then I wanted to look at First World War children's literature and say, okay, what impact did the war then have on how Canadian children were being taught about their nation? And then I started doing my research and going to all of these different archives that also had all kinds of interesting British and American children's literature from the First World War. And I didn't want to just abandon that interesting literature. So I wanted to write about these other texts, but I also realized looking at the literature from these different allied nations together and kind of comparing them, actually sort of shed a different light on what each nation's authors were saying, right, to the children in those countries that experienced the war differently, right? How is each nation kind of utilizing the war, so to speak, to develop these ideas about nationhood and about empire? So I found it more interesting, really, to think about those by looking at literature from the different countries. But then the project evolved even further to more specifically think about child figures. So the book that I'm now finally, at last, I hope, putting the finishing touches on, actually focuses on representations of children. So I'm interested in how reading about child figures, especially in a time of war, what impact that might have potentially had on how children saw themselves and how they understood childhood and how they understood their role in the nation as citizens. And so what I've discovered is that there's in fact a whole host of types of child figures in World War I literature, everything from child victims to to active children actively helping the war effort, and to boy soldiers. And even within each of those categories, we see a lot of variation. So just to give you one example, with boy soldiers, you have representations of children from allied nations, right, being held up as heroes because they've rushed off to enlist at an early age, younger than the legal age of enlistment. And that's a sign of their patriotism. And it's designed to, very clearly in a lot of cases, to encourage readers to do the same or to prepare themselves to enlist, right, the moment they come of age. But then if you look at how boy soldiers in Germany are portrayed in Allied literature, that heroism is not really the number one topic, right? In those examples, those boy soldiers are held up as examples of German brutality and decline of German society. So, and it is, sometimes like downright hypocritical because you'll see these contrasting views even in the same work of literature. So that's what the book is exploring, is all these different ways in which children are represented in this First World War literature.
And what inspired you particularly to look at wartime?
I think really in one sort of basic ways, because I'd finished my first book and body of research for my thesis with 1911. And then the obvious thing was, well, what happens next? And what happens next is obviously the First World War. And so that's why I started looking at the First World War. But really recently, right, I mean, in recent months, as we are now 100 years after the 1918 pandemic, right, that followed the First World War, as we're seeing this kind of upheaval that we haven't seen in a long time, at least in here in North America, it's become oddly timely in a way that I didn't necessarily expect it to be when I started the project.
As our last question, I was very fascinated to hear about this project that you're collaborating on, looking at children's representations in the ancient world. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about that, like what inspired that project, what's it about, and how is it going? Have you had to shift what you do, given that we're in the middle of this global pandemic? Has that affected your research in any way?
Yeah. Okay, so that project really is just another version, I guess, if that's the right word. It kind of carries on from my basic interest in things like nationalism and imperialism in children's literature. So again, kind of visiting this idea of how our national identities constructed and presented. So this time looking at how particular parts of the ancient world, and it's the ancient Near East specifically that we're looking at in this text. How were those being written about in the 19th century and in the present? What do those tell us about sort of views of those places, today, and how are those narratives also being used to kind of shape narratives about the national identity of places like Britain and the United States or Canada again, right, where authors who are writing these texts come from. So it continues that interest in sort of ideas of identity and children's literature. But it's also about archaeology, and how archaeology of the ancient Near East is represented in these children's texts. And that is because my co-author on that project is my husband, Kevin McGew, that you mentioned in your introduction, who is an archaeologist and an expert in the ancient Near East. So places like Mesopotamia and Egypt, right, are a focus of the book. And we're looking at, not only how those places were presented, but also how the discipline of archaeology itself kind of figures in children's literature. And so it's a joint project that arises out of our joint overlapping interests. And yes, it has been affected by the pandemic, because we also have a 5-year-old who is suddenly not in school and not in daycare, and we're trying to homeschool and parent full-time during the day. So it's really had an impact. We were lucky that last spring we actually made a really important research trip to the UK, where we were able to gather a lot of materials for our book. I'm very, very glad that we didn't postpone that till this summer. So at least we have some materials that we can be working on. But yes, we're trying to balance research and full-time care of a young one. So that's obviously slowed things down.
So is there anything, if you could tell us about what you've found so far? Have you discovered anything from that project yet? Have you got any hints of what we can expect to come out of it in the future? Can you give us a little taster?
So the taster, I would say, is it's just really striking how popular a subject this is in children's literature, and has been for over 100 years. And the number of ways in which themes about either archaeology or Egypt, ancient Mesopotamia manifest themselves. So we have everything from kind of Bible stories, retold for children, to choose your own adventure narratives, to the kinds of hands-on, blending of narrative and arts and crafts and word puzzles, those kinds of texts. So there's lots of different material culture for children, not just literature, that we see these ideas appear in. And I think that's really interesting at how it's such a rich topic, obviously, for children's literature, and has been for a very long time.
So where are you getting your material for this project from? From archives, or where are you getting your research materials?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So for the 19th century material, mostly in archives, which is one of the reasons we were over in the UK. I'm trying to remember the name of the specific library in Blythe House was one, which is part of the V&A museum. So archives for the 19th century stuff in particular, but also public libraries. So I've gathered a lot of materials over the years. The Toronto Public Library system, both specifically at the Osborne Collection, which is a children's literature collection within the public library system, but also just going into different branches and seeing what they have on the shelves to gather our more contemporary literature. So it's a range of sources.
Right. Well, that all sounds so interesting. Best of luck with finishing off that book. Best of luck with this project. So much for being willing to join us and tell us more about your research, and give us your excellent book recommendations as well, which I will be following up. So it just remains for me to say thank you to Elizabeth for joining us, and thank you for your excellent answers, and thank you at home for joining us. And hopefully when Elizabeth gives her public professor presentation, which is going to be including a lot of this material, you'll be able to join us then as well. So thank you all. I hope you're staying safe and well in these strange, wild and woolly times, and see you all soon. Goodbye.